G'day everyone, today I've got a tank healer hybrid for PvE using the Sword and Shield and Wand. This build has great individual and party sustain, but the trade-off is that you do pretty horrible damage. It's designed for you to primarily be the tank with very reliable self and party off healing. My favourite thing to do is this build is doubling as the tank and healer for co-op dungeons, allowing 5 DPS. Although this is highly dependent on your groups and your individual skill level. If everyone is hitting their defensive blocks and not standing in too much fire, this is absolutely viable, especially if your party can take a few support skills like Da Vinci's Courage or Nature's Blessing. It does place a lot of pressure on you though performing both roles, so maybe practice the build a bit before you try this. For matchmaking dungeons, even if you could queue as both tank and healer, which you can't, I wouldn't recommend this because matchmaking is just generally less organised and some groups can be a bit of a shit show. I'm sure you guys know that. But this is also where this build can shine. In those matchmaking groups where you can tell the healer is struggling a bit, or you've got some zug DPS standing in every mechanic possible, this build really helps to smooth out the party's mistakes and make the matchmaking experience far more consistent and enjoyable. You can also use the build for abyssal contract dungeons in the same way as either the only healer with 5 DPS or as an additional layer of healing support at the cost of lower group damage. So here's the one-page build guide. Pause or screenshot this if you wanted to copy this build and give it a go. As you can see, I've broken down your combat rotation and considerations into 3 groups: damage rotation, healing, and situational skills. So starting with our damage priority, Touch of Despair is your highest priority to build and maintain 3 stacks on any target you are fighting. This is obviously a source of damage from the curse dot itself, and also from buffing our auto attacks by 30% with 3 stacks, but more importantly, it's maintaining a completely passive source of healing from the passive skill Vampiric Contract. This passive converts 17% of all your damage against cursed targets into smart healing on the group. Smart healing is the term in MMOs when a healing spell automatically picks someone who is not full health and heals them without you having to target or anything. This amount of healing isn't going to save the group from large amounts of damage, but over the course of a boss fight or a big trash pack, this is really adding up to a lot of healing and really helps to passively keep people topped up. It's also just really cool converting damage to healing. I love skills like this. So always maintain Touch of Despair. You want to use this within 2 to 3 seconds of it being available so that the dot stacks don't fall off the target. So just press this on cooldown, always as your highest priority. For specialisations, take Radius Increased, which applies Touch of Despair to 2 additional targets. Very handy for giving us more damage and vampiric healing in AoE situations, although it's a strange name, bit of a mistranslation there I think. Effect Duration makes it heaps easier to maintain 3 stacks, and Curse gives us chance to add 2 stacks whenever we use this, which is good in non-boss situations because you're usually changing targets pretty often. Now your biggest damage combo is a Shot at Victory into Provoking Roar, Ray of Disaster, and then Counter Barrier. After applying your Touch of Despair, you'll start pretty much every pack or fight with this combo for big damage, and then those abilities cooldowns will desync for subsequent uses, so let me talk about each of them individually. A Shot at Victory is your hardest hitting standalone skill. It also buffs your sword skills for the next 6 or 8 seconds, which is mostly just Piercing Strike or the counter damage from Counter Barrier, which is stronger in AoE situations. After the initial opener, this will desync and come off cooldown a good 5 or 6 seconds before Provoking Roar and Ray of Disaster. On big AoE situations, hold this ability so to keep it synced with Provoking Roar, Ray of Disaster, and Counter Barrier, because the buff is worthwhile for the boosted Counter Barrier damage in AoE. But on single target bosses, Counter Barrier isn't really doing much at all, so just use a Shot at Victory off cooldown after the opening combo. We take the Enhanced Effect Specialisation to buff sword skills even more, and the effect duration increase to 8 seconds just to help get the entire 6-second counter barrier window inside the 8 seconds of this buff. Now Provoking Roar and Ray of Disaster should always be used together. Ray of Disaster synergizes really nicely with the passive Spectrum of Agony, because it ticks twice a second for 6 seconds, each tick triggering an instance of Spectrum of Agony damage on all targets with Provoking Roar. And this is the basis for your best AoE and single target damage combo. Always use Provoking Roar first, as its duration will get extended well out beyond the full 6 seconds of Ray of Disaster thanks to Spectrum of Agony. For Ray of Disaster, we take the cooldown reduction to bring it down to 30 seconds, so it syncs up exactly with Provoking Roar. We also take Targets Expanded so that it replicates the damage to 2 extra targets, which is amazing on AoE with Spectrum of Agony. For Provoking Roar, we want the duration increased to allow for more Spectrum of Agony procs, but don't take the cooldown reduction because we want to keep it synced with Ray of Disaster anyway, and we can invest those points somewhere else. Counter Barrier increases our block chance and deals counter attack damage every time we block or evade an attack for 6 seconds. On AoE, when lots of enemies are attacking you constantly, this has massive value. It gives huge damage reduction through more blocks and lots of counter damage. On single target though, because bosses attack so slowly, this doesn't do much at all defensively or offensively. Therefore, for big AoE, you definitely want to keep this synced with a shot at victory, Provoking Roar and Ray of Disaster, but on bosses, honestly, it doesn't really matter when you use it, just use it on cooldown with a shot at victory. No specializations for Counter Barrier, it does its job just fine as the normal version. Piercing Strike, which is your specialization of Shield Strike, is just your bread and butter filler. Just press this for some damage when nothing else is available. Just be aware it's one of your skills that does generate additional aggression when trying to gather up packs of enemies. For specializations, we take Piercing Strike to make it an AoE cone, very handy for damage and pulling aggression in AoE packs, as well as the aggression spec itself for more threat as discussed. Now you will have a bit of downtime in this build because a bunch of our spells are for healing, which you don't want to just press on cooldown like we do for damage. That's okay, just let your auto attacks do their thing while you take a breath. When you're tanking and healing, having a less intense rotation is actually a good thing, because you can take a moment to look up at the party frames, check health bars, think about what's happening next in the fight, and so on. You're not completely fixated on hitting that DPS rotation perfectly. So let's look at our healing spells and when to use them. Fountain of Life places an area of effect on the ground that heals any allies in it twice a second for 6 seconds. This is your most potent heal if your allies stay in the area for more than about 4 seconds of that time. This should be your go-to heal when 2 or more allies have taken a moderate amount of damage, especially if they are grouped or stacked together, and you can make the most of hitting yourself and them if they're close. I recommend taking all 3 specializations for this skill. Mana Recovery restores a good amount of mana for you and your allies. Increasing the radius makes it far more likely you're going to catch more people in the healing, and increasing the duration by 2 seconds is essentially a 33% increase as the baseline duration is only 6 seconds. This means it's also your most efficient heal, because with the mana specialization you return 640 mana over the full duration to yourself and allies, so it actually costs you basically no mana if you're in the effect the whole time. It's also got the shorter cooldown of your 2 AoE healing abilities. I don't recommend saving this as your emergency group heal, and actually use this very proactively. As an emergency group-wide heal, Fountain is actually not your best option because you'll often have some David with the longbow standing as far away as possible on the other side of the room, and it's not going to hit them. If I'd used Fountain then, he wouldn't have got healed. So for that type of emergency group-wide healing, I recommend Clay's Salvation. Clay's Salvation is a simple press of the button to heal all party members in range for a good chunk of healing. As I said, keep this one for your emergency party-wide heal. Don't use this until at least 4 or 5 members in the party have taken moderate damage and are all spread out all over the place. This is where this ability really shines. I recommend taking the range increase for this just to make sure it's even more likely that you'll catch Dave out on the other side of the room with the longbow. If he's just out of range, the ability is worthless and does nothing to help him. Invincible Wall gives allies an absorb shield. I recommend using this always with the target's expanded specialization as well as the range specialization. This means that it becomes a big area of effect ability that gives all your party members that are in range an absorb shield at a slightly reduced amount. So it's not quite as strong as it is on single targets, but it's still pretty good. The best way to use this is proactively. The best kind of healing is the healing you don't need to do. So if you know there's some area of effect party damage coming up, use this so that people chew through their absorb shield before even taking damage that you have to heal. You can also just use it as an emergency button, similar to Clay's Salvation, just to give yourself a bit of time. And finally, Swift Healing is your basic individual spot heal with a low cooldown. Use this very reactively whenever anyone takes a moderate amount of damage. We take the additional consecutive use so that you have 3 charges of this in a row, which is quite a bit of single target healing. You also want to take Healing Transfer, as it's a great way to just keep yourself topped up while taking care of the rest of the party. And you want to take Mana Recovery as well. Again, just a bit of support, keeping people's mana topped up is always useful. I'll quickly touch on Vampiric Contract Healing, which is the passive healing from our damage I talked about before. You'll notice I kept specifically saying whenever your allies have taken a moderate amount of damage. A big part of healing in this game, especially as you don't have access to any spammable heals, is knowing when not to heal. If people have only taken a small amount of damage, I'm talking up to 20 or 25% even of their health bar, especially if you're comfortable with the fight and know that there's no incoming damage soon, then just let people's regen kick in, let the smart heals do their job, and allow them to just trickle back up to full health slowly. You'll get a feel for this, and this definitely comes with a bit of instinct and experience with the specific encounters and boss fights, so that you actually understand when is a dangerous time to be sitting at 75% health, and when you're perfectly safe, there's no damage coming. For our situational abilities, we have Strategic Rush. This is situational because you can either use it for mob control to position them, move them, or stun them. Typically on trash packs, you'll use it this way, whereas on boss fights, you might want to save it for a bit of mobility, but you're probably better off just using it on cooldown against the boss, because when it's used on a target immune to collision, you get 40 base damage instead for 6 seconds, which is quite a nice chunk. Finally, Chain Hook is your last situational one. You'll basically use this as required to maneuver and control mobs around. Very handy ability for tanks to have in their toolkit. I don't put any spec points into Strategic Rush or Chain Hook. They just do their job already. For passives, Aegis Shield, Resilient Mind, and Impenetrable are standard defensive options. Spectrum of Agony is important for our damage, and then from the wand we take Vampiric Contract, which I've talked about already. Noble Revival just gives us flat 10% or more skill healing, scaling with your mana. Devotion and Emptiness gives a good amount of healing or damage and cooldown reduction depending on if it's night or day. And Selfless Soul stacks up skill healing and mana regen when we heal people. This works nicely with Fountain of Life as it fully stacks up to 5 in about 2 seconds and buffing all healing by a very solid amount. Saint Oath is no good because we don't take skill damage in PvE. We don't really need more curse duration in this build from Wraith's Beacon, and the buffs from Full of Corruption proc when enemies are dying, which is no good for bosses, and generally the least dangerous part of any trash pack is when they're dying because it's starting to thin out, so the other options are just better flat bonuses. For stats, prioritize Strength and Wisdom over Dex, then Perception last. Always aim for 30, 40 and 50 tier bonuses where you can for Strength and Wisdom, depending on what gear you have access to. Traits in PvE don't really matter too much, but if you wanted to min-max, get some crit and heavy attack on your weapons, then melee evasion, max HP, and regens are the best for PvE. I don't think bosses and monsters deal critical strikes, although I haven't been able to actually confirm that, but either way, I don't recommend any endurance. If you wanted to go after specific bits of gear, for the sword, go for either Karnix's Netherblade, which gives base strength as well as max HP, which is nice, or Azrael's Siphoning Sword is also good, as it also gives strength and mana regen, which for a Templar is not bad. And for your wand, the Tome of Proximate Remedy has high strength, which is really nice for this build. For armor, the Field General set is a really good generic tanky bruiser set, and the Shock Commander set is very late game gear for even more block stat, but otherwise just get a nice spread of purple gear with some decent traits and decent gear. For PvE, it doesn't really matter too much. The whole stat, like build crafting stuff, really comes into play for PvP. And that's it, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this build. I've really enjoyed being a bit of a tanky healer hybrid. It's actually quite a lot of fun getting those like damage numbers from tanking, but also doing a whole bunch of healing and being able to support the party. It's quite satisfying. If you like the build, please drop me a like, comment, or subscribe. Thanks for listening, everyone. Cheers.